In the winter of 1944, an officer with the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend wrote a short entry in his after-action notes before the offensive began. It read, "Intelligence says this division has never fired a shot in anger. We will be through them by nightfall." He was wrong by more than 72 hours, and by more men than his division could afford to lose. He was describing the 99th Infantry Division, activated barely 2 years earlier, deployed to a quiet sector of Belgium precisely because command believed nothing serious would happen there. Nothing serious was about to happen there, for the Germans. Before we go further, if accounts like this, told through the words of the men who tried and failed to break these units, are the kind of history you want more of, subscribe now. There's a lot more of the line left to hold, and a lot more of what the enemy admitted, once nobody was listening. This is not a story about a veteran division proving itself again. Veteran divisions are supposed to hold. This is something stranger. This is the account of what happened when the main effort of an entire German offensive, a Waffen-SS Panzer Army built around fanatical teenage recruits and hardened Eastern Front officers, ran into a division that had been in the line for exactly 11 days, had never conducted a large-scale attack or defense, and by every rule of military logic, should have folded within hours. It did not fold. The story does not begin with a legendary unit earning its reputation. It begins with the opposite. Cooks, clerks, and green riflemen, barely out of basic training, holding a frozen ridge because nobody had told them yet that they were supposed to lose. And it ends with German officers, men who had broken through Poland, France, and deep into Russia, writing reports trying to explain how a division with no combat history had cost them the one thing their entire offensive could not survive losing: time. The 99th Infantry Division was activated in November of 1942 at Camp Van Dorn, Mississippi, and later completed its training at Camp Maxey, Texas. Like most of the Army's late war infantry divisions, it was built from men who had never expected to be soldiers, school teachers from Ohio, farmhands from the Dakotas, factory workers from New Jersey, pulled together and run through a training cycle that emphasized fundamentals over specialization, because there was no time for anything else. The division did not have the luxury the airborne divisions had of selecting for physical extremes. It trained the men it was given on a compressed schedule and shipped them to Europe in the fall of 1944. They landed in November, more than 2 years after activation, but with almost no combat experience among the enlisted ranks. Command assigned the 99th to a sector of the Ardennes forest along the Belgian-German border that intelligence considered quiet, a place to season green troops gradually, away from the weight of the war. German intelligence reached a similar conclusion from the other direction. Reconnaissance reports circulating through the 6th Panzer Army described the opposing division in dismissive terms: inexperienced, thinly spread, unlikely to resist a determined push. Some German officers privately used a phrase that would later come back to them with an irony none of them intended. They called the men across the line the greenest division in the American Army. They meant it as a reason to expect an easy breakthrough. They were about to learn it was not going to be one. The German main effort came through the Losheim Gap in the pre-dawn hours of December 16th, spearheaded by paratroopers of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division with the armor of Kampfgruppe Piper, the lead element of the entire 6th Panzer Army's drive toward the Meuse, stacked up behind them on a single road, waiting for the infantry to clear the way. That road ran directly through a small rise above the village of Lanzerath, held by 18 men, an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon under a 20-year-old lieutenant named Lyle Buck. They were not supposed to be a blocking force. Reconnaissance platoons exist to observe and report, not to stand and fight an army. They stood and fought an army. For nearly 20 hours, 18 men with rifles, a few machine guns, and no artillery support of their own held a ridge against repeated assaults by a force that outnumbered them by more than 50 to 1. German casualties from the fighting at Lanzerath that day are estimated in the range of 90 to 150 men, inflicted by a platoon that never numbered more than 18. A German paratroop officer involved in organizing the renewed assaults that afternoon later dictated a report that made its way into division records. "We had been told the road was open. We spent a full day discovering it was not. Against a unit our maps did not even show as a fighting formation." By the time the position finally fell that evening, not broken but surrounded and out of ammunition, the platoon had bought something no amount of German armor could buy back: an entire day. Kampfgruppe Piper's timetable, built around speed above all else, was already broken before the column reached open road. Every hour lost at Lanzerath was an hour the rest of the 99th Infantry Division used to dig in on the ridge behind them. Lanzerath was one ridge. The Losheim Gap was 6 miles of front, and the 99th did not have the numbers to hold 6 miles the way Buch's platoon had held one. What it had instead were isolated companies, cut off from each other by the terrain and the speed of the German advance, each one forced to make its own decision about whether to withdraw or hold in place, with no idea what was happening a half-mile away. Private First Class Frank Kudlach, a machine gunner with the 3rd Battalion, 394th Infantry Regiment, found himself in exactly that position on the morning of December 17th, his squad cut off from the rest of the company by an armored column that had already passed behind them. He later described the choice in blunt terms. "We didn't know if anybody else was still out there. We didn't know if we were the last ones. We just knew the gun was still working, so we kept it working." His position held through 2 separate infantry assaults before a runner finally reached them with orders to fall back to the regimental line, orders that arrived only because the delay his squad had bought gave headquarters time to organize a coherent withdrawal instead of a route. That pattern repeated itself up and down the Losheim Gap through the 17th and into the 18th. Small, isolated groups of green soldiers, cut off and outnumbered, choosing to hold rather than run, buying hours that added up to something the German timetable could not absorb. A Volksgrenadier officer attached to the 277th Division, tasked with clearing resistance the SS armor had bypassed, wrote afterward that his unit's advance schedule had assumed pockets of this kind would surrender or scatter within an hour of being surrounded. Instead, he wrote, "We found ourselves fighting the same 40 or 50 men for most of a day, in a position we had already reported as cleared." The 99th was falling back. Nobody disputes that the division gave ground during those first 72 hours. But it was giving ground on its own schedule, not the German offensives, and every hour of difference was an hour 6th Panzer Army had budgeted for a breakthrough and did not get. By December 17th, the survivors of the forward positions were falling back on the twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath, where the 99th's remaining line met the 2nd Infantry Division, brought up from the north to help hold the shoulder. What followed over the next 3 days was some of the most brutal close-range fighting of the entire campaign, German armor pushing directly into village streets, American infantry engaging tanks at ranges of 30 and 40 yards with bazookas and satchel charges because there was no room to maneuver and no time to fall back further. SS Hauptsturmführer Werner Purchke, a company commander whose armor was committed to the assault on the villages, later gave an account during his post-war interrogation that Allied intelligence flagged as unusually candid for a Waffen-SS officer. "We had tanks, we had numbers. What we did not have," he said, "was room to use either one because they would not give us the streets." His unit lost 4 tanks in a single afternoon to close-range infantry attacks, vehicles that, in open country, no infantry formation could have touched. In the confusion of house-to-house fighting, American artillery observers began calling fire directly onto their own forward positions, a tactic normally reserved for units on the verge of being overrun, trusting the accuracy of their own gunners over the certainty of losing the village. The tactic worked. It cost lives on both sides of the American line, but it broke the cohesion of the German assault at the exact moment the attackers believed the villages were falling. By the time the order came to withdraw to Elsenborn Ridge on the night of December 19th, the fighting at Krinkelt-Rocherath had cost the German 12th SS Panzer Division dozens of armored vehicles it could not replace on any timetable the offensive required. A staff officer with the division's operations section wrote in a report later recovered by Allied forces, "The villages were rubble by the time we held them. Rubble does not open a road to the Meuse. The 99th and 2nd Infantry Divisions had not won the battle for the villages in any conventional sense. They had abandoned them, but they had made the ground so expensive that holding it meant nothing to the German timetable anymore." What was left of the 99th Infantry Division dug into Elsenborn Ridge alongside the 2nd Infantry Division on the night of December 19th, and there it stopped moving. For the next several days, the ridge absorbed everything the 6th Panzer Army could throw at it, Infantry assaults, armored thrusts, and an artillery bombardment so sustained that American gunners on the position later described the ground itself as never fully going quiet, day or night. Unlike the fighting at the villages, this was not room-to-room combat. This was a fixed defensive line, dug into frozen ground, absorbing direct assault after direct assault from an enemy that could not afford to go around it. The reason the Germans could not simply bypass Elsenborn Ridge was terrain and roads. It commanded the high ground over the road network the 6th Panzer Army needed to push its armor north and west toward Liège. Every division committed to taking it and failing was a division not advancing the offensive's main objective. A German artillery officer supporting the assaults, in a diary entry recovered after the war, wrote, "We have fired more shells at this ridge in 4 days than I fired in 4 months in Russia, and the ridge has not moved." Vop. That single sentence, "the ridge has not moved," became something close to a standing joke among the Americans, holding it once word of the captured diary circulated after the war, because it was recorded not as an insult, but as a simple, exhausted statement of fact from a man whose entire professional expectation of what artillery does to a defensive position had failed to apply. The 99th Infantry Division, a formation with 11 days of combat experience when the offensive began, held its portion of that ridge until the German attacks in the sector were called off entirely in favor of shifting weight elsewhere along the front. Divisional after-action estimates placed German casualties in the fighting from December 16th through the stand at Elsenborn in a ratio of roughly 5-1 against the 99th's own losses. A division dismissed in German planning documents as unlikely to resist a determined push had, by the numbers, outfought the force sent to break it. After the offensive stalled, the German 15th Army's intelligence section compiled a tactical review of the fighting along the northern shoulder, drawing on unit reports from the 12th SS Panzer, the 3rd Fallschirmjäger, and the 277th Volksgrenadier divisions, all of whom had thrown men at the 99th sector and failed to break it on schedule. The document, later recovered and translated by Allied intelligence, does not focus on American artillery superiority or numerical strength, because on paper, neither existed. The 99th was outnumbered and outgunned in nearly every engagement described. Instead, the report focuses on something the compiling officer struggled to categorize using standard military vocabulary. He gave it a name: unerwartete Standfestigkeit, unexpected steadfastness. The report goes on to describe what German planners had assumed would happen when green, untested troops encountered a coordinated armored assault, that isolated positions would fold quickly, that units cut off from their chain of command would surrender rather than fight blind, that inexperience under this kind of pressure would produce panic rather than discipline. None of that happened at the rate German doctrine predicted. The officer compiling the report wrote, "We had prepared for an experienced defense and found instead an inexperienced one that simply did not behave like one. Green troops are supposed to break early or not at all. These broke late, if they broke, and reformed faster than veteran formations we have fought elsewhere." He attributes this not to superior training. The report explicitly notes the division's short time in the field, but to something closer to a default posture the American replacement and training system seemed to instill, regardless of experience level, a baseline refusal to treat encirclement or isolation as a reason to stop fighting. It is a strange document to read because it is a professional soldier's attempt to explain, using the only vocabulary available to him, that the normal relationship between experience and battlefield performance had not applied. The 99th was not supposed to be hard to break. It broke less than divisions that had fought since Normandy. The German planners never fully accounted for why. The officer who opened this account, Hauptmann Erich Vogler, the 12th SS Panzer staff officer who wrote, "We will be through them by nightfall," survived the Ardennes, was captured in the closing weeks of the war, and spent just over 2 years in an American POW camp before returning to a defeated Germany trying to rebuild itself. He gave few interviews about his wartime service in the decades that followed. In 1987, a regional historian working on an oral history project about the 6th Panzer Army's campaign in the Ardennes tracked him down and asked, almost in passing, about the entry in his own after-action notes from December 1944, the line about being through the American line by nightfall. He was quiet for a long moment before he answered. He said he remembered writing it. He said he remembered believing it completely, not as bravado, but as a simple professional calculation based on everything intelligence had told him about the division across the line. Then he said something the historian included almost verbatim in the published transcript. I was not wrong about their experience. I was wrong about what experience means. I have thought about that ridge more in the years since the war than I thought about any battle I actually won. He did not elaborate further, and the interview moved on to other subjects. The 99th Infantry Division went on to fight for the rest of the war in Europe, but it is Elsenborn Ridge, those first 11 days and the days immediately after, that the division is remembered for. Not because it was the war's largest battle or its most decisive, but because a formation with no combat history, dismissed in advance by the officers sent to break it, held ground that an army built for speed could not afford to lose time in front of. Vogler had his answer before the war ended. It simply was not the one his notes had predicted.